The city always felt different at night, as if it had a second personality hidden beneath the chaos of daylight. The crowds disappeared, leaving behind a skeleton of quiet streets and distant hums. It was the time when people like me, insomniacs, loners, and lost souls, found ourselves wandering for reasons we couldn't quite explain. Tonight was no different, or at least it didn't seem so at first. It was past midnight, and the air was damp with the faint mist of an earlier rain. The wet pavement reflected the dim, orange glow of the streetlights, stretching their beams across the empty road. I shoved my hands deep into my coat pockets, pulling it tighter around me. The wind had a bite to it, sneaking in through every gap in the fabric. Why did I even leave my apartment? I didn't have an answer. Maybe it was the weight of the fight I'd had with my boss earlier in the day, or the fact that my apartment, small and suffocating, was filled with reminders of how little I'd accomplished. Every bill I couldn't pay, every unopened letter sitting on the counter, it all screamed failure. My shoes made a rhythmic tapping sound as I walked, the only noise breaking the silence apart from the occasional rustle of leaves or the far-off sound of a car engine. I told myself it was just another walk to clear my head, but the truth was my head never felt clear no matter how far I walked. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought my tired mind was playing tricks on me. She stood under a streetlight about a block away, her silhouette sharp against the flickering glow. She wasn't moving, just standing there perfectly still. Her long white dress billowed slightly in the breeze, and her hair, long, flowing, and impossibly luminous, cascaded over her shoulders. I froze mid-step, my breath catching in my throat. The street was deserted. There was no one else around. What was she doing here? And why did she look so surreal? I glanced around, hoping to see someone else, a passerby, a late-night jogger, anyone who could confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. But the streets were as empty as they'd been all night. It was just me and her. Something about her presence made my skin prickle, but not in fear. It wasn't that kind of unease. No, it was something deeper, like my body recognized something my mind couldn't understand. I hesitated, torn between walking away and approaching her. Common sense told me to mind my own business. The world isn't kind to curious people who get involved with strangers in the middle of the night. But curiosity tugged at me, a whispering voice in the back of my head telling me this was no ordinary encounter. "Hello," I called out, my voice shakier than I intended. It echoed off the buildings around us, fading into the distance. She turned her head slowly, her movements smooth and deliberate, like she had all the time in the world. When her eyes met mine, I felt a jolt of something I couldn't name. Her gaze wasn't piercing or harsh, but it carried a weight that made my chest tighten. And then she smiled. I can't explain that smile. It wasn't just kind or comforting. It was transformative. It felt like it reached into some dark, hidden part of me, the part one tried to ignore most days. It was the kind of smile that made you want to believe in something, even if you didn't know what that something was. "Are you lost?" she asked, her voice soft and melodic. It carried through the cold night air, as if the wind itself bent to carry her words. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. "No," I managed to say, though I wasn't entirely sure it was true. "I'm just walking." Her expression didn't change, but something about her gaze shifted, as if she could see through the lie. She took a step forward, her bare feet making no sound on the wet pavement. The movement should have been strange. Who walks barefoot in the middle of the city at night? But it wasn't. Not for her. She stopped a few feet away from me, close enough that I could see the faint glow of her skin. It wasn't like the fluorescent buzz of a streetlight or the harsh gleam of a smartphone screen. It was soft, almost imperceptible, like she carried her own light source that the world couldn't extinguish. "I've been waiting for you," she said, her voice calm, as if the statement were the most natural thing in the world. I blinked, startled. Waiting for me? I don't even know you. She tilted her head slightly, her hair catching the light in a way that made it shimmer. Don't you? Something about her words made my stomach flip. She wasn't speaking in riddles, exactly, but her tone carried a knowing quality that made me uneasy. I wanted to walk away, to shake off whatever this was and convince myself it was just a bizarre encounter with a stranger. But my feet wouldn't move. What do you mean? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She stepped closer, close enough now that I could see the intricate details of her face. She was beautiful in a way that felt almost alien, as if she didn't belong to this world. Her eyes, a soft gold that seemed to shift in the light, locked onto mine. You have questions, she said, about why everything feels so broken. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. How could she know that? She didn't know me, no one did. But her words hit a nerve, the kind of truth you spend years burying, because it hurts too much to confront. I wanted to deny it, to tell her she was wrong, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I nodded, unable to speak. She reached out a hand, her movements slow and deliberate. I should have pulled away, but I didn't. Her fingers brushed against my forehead, warm and soft. And in that instant, the world dissolved into light. For a moment, there was nothing, no city, no wind, no cold night air. Just an endless expanse of light, warm and comforting. It wrapped around me like a blanket, soothing the parts of me I didn't even know were hurting. And then, just as quickly as it began, it was over. I was no longer standing on the street, but somewhere else entirely. A place I couldn't recognize, but one that felt strangely familiar. And she was still there, standing a few steps ahead, waiting. What had I just stepped into? And why did I feel like my life was about to change forever? The light was everywhere. It wasn't blinding or harsh. It was warm, soft, and enveloping, like stepping into a memory of sunlight on a crisp morning. I couldn't see anything but white, yet I wasn't afraid. There was something comforting about it, something that whispered I was safe. Then, slowly, the light began to shift. Shadows emerged, faint outlines of something taking shape. I blinked, trying to make sense of the transition, and as the brightness softened, I found myself standing in a vast, open field. The grass was tall and golden, swaying gently in a breeze I couldn't feel. Above me stretched an endless sky, deep blue and impossibly clear, as though the universe itself had paused to hold its breath. She was still with me. I turned, half expecting her to be gone, to wake up from this surreal moment and find myself back on the damp city street. But there she was, standing a few steps ahead, just as serene as before. Her white dress moved as if the wind was alive, brushing against her like it was drawn to her light. She didn't look at me right away. Instead, she gazed out at the horizon, as if there was something out there only she could see. What is this place? I asked, my voice sounding small in the vastness around us. She turned then, her golden eyes meeting mine, and for a moment, I felt as though she could see everything. Not just the version of me standing here, but every hidden part of me, the good, the bad, the things I didn't even like to admit to myself. It wasn't a feeling of judgment, though. If anything, it felt like she understood. This is where it begins, she said simply, her voice carrying the same calm certainty that had stopped me in my tracks earlier. Where what begins? I asked, my confusion mounting. What is this? How did we get here? She smiled, and there was something in that smile, a knowing, an assurance that whatever was happening was meant to be. Your life has been heavy for so long, she said. You've been carrying more than you realize. Here you'll see. See what? I pressed, frustration creeping into my voice. I didn't mean to sound angry, but I couldn't help it. None of this made sense. I'd gone for a walk to clear my head, and now I was standing in a field that couldn't possibly exist, talking to a woman who seemed to defy every rule of reality. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she raised her hand, and as she did, the air around us shimmered, like heat rising off asphalt on a summer day. It started faintly at first, a ripple in the fabric of this strange world, but then the shimmer grew stronger, more defined. Shapes began to form in the air, translucent at first, but quickly solidifying into something vivid, something real. I gasped as I realized what I was looking at. Memories. My memories. The first one was from when I was a kid, no more than 8 years old. I saw myself sitting on the floor of my childhood home, clutching a broken toy. My mother was in the background, her face tired, her voice sharp as she scolded me for breaking it. I remembered that day. I dropped the toy accidentally, and she'd been so stressed, so overwhelmed, that she snapped at me without meaning to. I could still feel the sting of her words, the way they made me feel small, unimportant. Even now, years later, that feeling hadn't completely left me. The scene shifted, and another memory took its place. This one was from my teenage years. I was standing in a hallway at school, clutching my books tightly as a group of kids laughed nearby. I wasn't part of their laughter. I was the target of it. They didn't say anything directly to me, but I knew it was about me. The way they glanced in my direction, the way their voices grew louder when I walked by. That sense of isolation, of not belonging, was as sharp now as it had been then. The memories kept coming, one after another, each one tugging at a thread I thought I'd buried long ago. Failed relationships, missed opportunities, arguments that left me hollow, moments of doubt, fear, and regret piling up like bricks in a wall I'd built around myself. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked, my voice cracking under the weight of it all. "I already know these things. I live them." She stepped closer, her presence steady, grounding. "You've been running from them," she said, "carrying them like stones in your pocket. But you've never truly faced them." "I don't want to face them," I said, my hands balling into fists at my sides. "What good would it do? It's not like I can change the past." Her gaze softened, and she reached out, placing a hand gently on my shoulder. It was the first time she'd touched me since that moment on the street, and just like then, her touch was warm, soothing. "The past shapes us," she said, her voice gentle, "but it doesn't define us. It's not about changing what happened. It's about understanding it, accepting it, and letting it go." I wanted to argue, to tell her she didn't understand what it was like to carry the weight of all those failures, all that pain. But deep down, I knew she was right. I had been carrying it, dragging it behind me like a chain, letting it pull me deeper into a place I didn't know how to escape. As I stood there, staring at the memories playing out around us, I began to notice something. The pain was still there, yes, but so were other things. The kindness of a stranger who'd helped me when I was stranded. The warmth of a friend's laugh after a particularly hard day. The times I gotten back up, even when it felt impossible. Those moments were part of me, too, though I'd buried them under layers of hurt. "You're not defined by your pain," she said, as if reading my thoughts. "You're defined by how you rise from it." Her words hung in the air, settling into the space between us like a lifeline. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to breathe deeply. The tightness in my chest began to loosen, and the weight I'd been carrying didn't feel quite so unbearable. As the memories faded, replaced once more by the golden field and endless sky, I looked at her, searching for the right words. "What happens now?" I asked. She smiled again, that same serene smile that made me feel like maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. "That's up to you," she said. "But remember, you're stronger than you think. And the light you're searching for, it's been with you all along." I didn't fully understand what she meant, not yet. But for the first time in a long time, I felt something stir within me. Hope! The memories stayed with me. Even as the golden field around us began to shimmer again, the images folding into themselves like they were being pulled away by an unseen hand. I watched as the warmth of the field was replaced by something colder, darker. The endless sky faded into gray, and the golden grass gave way to shadows creeping in from all directions. The ground beneath my feet turned hard, cracked, as though it hadn't felt rain in years. A chill ran through me, and I instinctively wrapped my arms around myself. She was still there, standing as steady as before, her glow softer now, but no less present. She didn't seem affected by the change in the atmosphere. Her gaze fixed on me with the same calm intensity. "What's happening?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Where are we now?" "This is the place you avoid," she said. "The part of yourself you've been too afraid to face." I shook my head, my chest tightening. "I don't understand. I didn't choose this." "I didn't." She stepped closer, her golden eyes holding mine. "Not choosing is still a choice," she said gently. "You've spent so much of your life running, burying the parts of yourself that hurt, pretending they don't exist. But they're still here, waiting for you." Her words landed like stones in my stomach, heavy and unyielding. I wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, that I wasn't running from anything. But as I looked around, the truth pressed against me like the cold air of this desolate place. I knew exactly what she meant. I'd spent years pretending I was fine, telling myself I didn't need to think about the past. But deep down, I'd always felt the weight of it, dragging me down no matter how far I tried to push it away. The shadows around us began to move, taking shape. I flinched as figures emerged from the darkness, vague at first, then clearer, more defined. They weren't strangers. They were parts of me. The first figure was hunched over, its face pale and tired, eyes sunken with exhaustion. It was me, but not the me standing here. It was the version of me who had given up, the one who stopped trying because it was easier to avoid failure than to risk it. I watched as it sat down on the cracked ground, its head in its hands, radiating a despair so deep it was hard to breathe. Another figure appeared, standing tall but rigid, its face blank, expressionless. This one was different, cold, detached, like it didn't care about anything or anyone. I recognized it too, the part of me that shut people out when things got hard, the one that told itself it didn't need anyone because needing people meant getting hurt. More figures joined them, each one a reflection of a version of myself I didn't want to see. The angry one, fist clenched and teeth bared, always ready to lash out when the pain became too much. The scared one, small and trembling, hiding from the world because it felt safer to stay invisible. The lonely one, sitting quietly at the edge of the group, looking at the others with eyes full of longing, but too afraid to reach out. I wanted to turn away, to close my eyes and pretend they weren't there. But she stood beside me, her presence steady and unyielding. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Why do I have to see this?" "Because they're part of you," she said. "And until you face them, they'll keep controlling you." "I don't want them to be part of me," I said, my throat tight with the effort of holding back tears. "I don't want to be angry or scared or broken." Her expression softened, and for a moment, she looked almost sad. "Being broken isn't the same as being unfixable," she said. "These parts of you, they're not your enemy. They're just trying to protect you in the only way they know how. But they've been carrying a burden they were never meant to bear." I looked at the figures again, and for the first time, I saw them differently. They weren't just versions of me. They were pieces of me that had stepped in when I didn't know how to handle the pain. The angry one, the detached one, the scared one. They'd all been trying, in their own flawed ways, to keep me safe. "What do I do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "You forgive them," she said. You forgive yourself. The words hit me like a wave, breaking over the walls I'd built around myself. Forgiveness. I'd spent so much time blaming myself for everything that had gone wrong in my life. Every mistake, every failure, every moment of weakness. The idea of forgiving myself felt foreign, almost impossible. But as I stood there, looking at the fractured parts of myself, I realized that holding on to the blame hadn't helped me. It had only made the weight heavier. I took a step toward the figures, my heart pounding. The angry one looked at me with defiance, but there was fear in its eyes too, a fear I recognized as my own. I knelt in front of it, my hands trembling. "I'm sorry," I said. "I know you were trying to protect me, but you don't have to do it alone anymore." The anger in its eyes softened, and it slowly faded into the shadows. I moved to the next figure, then the next, speaking the words I hadn't known I needed to say. To each one, I offered understanding, forgiveness, and the promise that they didn't have to carry the burden anymore. One by one, they disappeared, leaving behind a strange, aching emptiness, but also a lightness I hadn't felt in years. When the last figure was gone, I stood up, my legs shaky but steady. She was still there, watching me with a quiet smile. "It's not easy to face yourself," she said, "but you did it. That's the first step." I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. The landscape around us began to change again, the cracks in the ground healing, the shadows receding. The cold air grew warmer, and the faintest hint of golden light returned to the horizon. As I turned to face her, I felt something shift inside me, a small, fragile spark of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to hold on to, enough to take the next step, and then the next. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't running anymore. When the shadows finally faded and the golden light began to seep back into the cracked earth, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: stillness. Not the oppressive, empty kind of stillness that comes from exhaustion or giving up, but a quietness that felt alive. It settled into my chest, filling the spaces that had once been crammed full of noise, doubt, and anger. She stood beside me, her glow softer now, almost muted, but still unmistakable. I looked at her, wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but the words caught in my throat. It wasn't just gratitude I felt. It was something deeper, a sense of awe. She'd brought me to this place, shown me the parts of myself I'd spent a lifetime avoiding. And now, even though I was still raw from the experience, I felt lighter, freer. But there was something else too, a new awareness that made the silence between us feel heavier than it should have. As the landscape around us shifted once more, softening into a rolling meadow with gentle hills and patches of wildflowers, I turned to her, unable to hold the question back any longer. "Why me?" I asked. "Out of everyone in the world, why did you choose me?" Her gaze met mine, steady and calm, as though she'd been waiting for me to ask. "Because you're ready," she said simply. "Ready for what?" I pressed, frustration creeping into my voice. I'm nobody. I've made so many mistakes. I've hurt people, failed people. I don't even know if I can fix any of it. So why would you think I'm ready for anything?" She took a step closer, and for the first time, I noticed the faintest flicker of something behind her calm expression, a sadness, maybe, or understanding. "Do you think healing only comes to the perfect?" she asked. "That change is reserved for those who've never faltered?" I shook my head, unsure of how to answer. "I don't know," I said finally. "It just doesn't feel like I deserve this." Her smile returned, gentle but unyielding. "Deserving has nothing to do with it," she said. "You're here because you chose to be here. Whether you realize it or not, something inside you reached out. Something wanted more." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Deep down, I knew she was right. I'd spent so long convincing myself that nothing would ever get better, but I didn't even notice the part of me that had been quietly hoping for something, anything, to change. Maybe that's why I'd gone walking that night. Maybe that's why I'd stopped when I saw her, instead of turning the other way. What happens now? I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. That depends on you, she said. The hardest part is over. You've faced your shadows. You've begun to let them go. But healing isn't a single moment. It's a journey, and the next step is yours to take. The thought was overwhelming. I'd spent so much energy just getting through each day, carrying the weight of everything I thought I had to hide. Now that the weight was lighter, I wasn't sure what to do with the space it left behind. I don't know where to start, I admitted. She tilted her head slightly, her expression thoughtful. Then let me show you. Before I could ask what she meant, she raised her hand, and the air around us shimmered again. This time, the images that appeared weren't memories. They were possibilities. I saw myself in a dozen different scenarios, some small, others life-changing. In one, I was apologizing to a friend I'd lost touch with, the two of us laughing together like no time had passed. In another, I was sitting at a desk, writing something with a focus I hadn't felt in years. I didn't know what it was, a letter, a story, maybe even a plan, but the act of creating something felt alive, electric. In another vision, I was standing in front of a group of people, speaking with a confidence I didn't recognize, yet somehow knew was mine. The scenes shifted rapidly, each one a glimpse of a life I hadn't dared to imagine for myself. There was love, connection, purpose. There were failures too, but they weren't the crushing, soul-draining kind I'd been so afraid of. They were stepping stones, moments of growth. And through it all, there was a sense of forward motion, of a life that wasn't defined by regret or fear, but by choice. These aren't promises, she said, her voice pulling me back to the present. They're possibilities. Each one is a door you could choose to walk through, if you're willing. I stared at the fading images, my heart pounding. It was overwhelming, seeing all the things I could be, all the ways my life could change if I just tried. But it was terrifying too. What if I failed again? What if I wasn't strong enough to follow through? You don't have to know everything now, she said, as if reading my thoughts. You don't have to have all the answers. All you need to do is take the first step. What if I can't do it? I asked. What if I mess up again? Her smile widened, a spark of warmth in her golden eyes. You will mess up, she said. That's part of it. But every step, every stumble, is still forward. And no matter how many times you fall, you'll get back up. You've already proven that you can. Her words settled over me, filling the cracks that doubt had left behind. I didn't know if I believed in myself yet, but maybe, just maybe, I could start a try. Will you still be here? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Her glow brightened, just for a moment. I'll always be with you, she said. Not here, not like this, but in the light you carry now, the light you've always had. You're never truly alone. I wanted to hold on to her, to ask her to stay, but even as I opened my mouth to speak, she began to fade. The glow around her softened until it was no brighter than the sunlight filtering through the clouds. Her figure became translucent, blending into the golden light of the meadow. Remember, she said, her voice lingering even as she disappeared. The light is within you. It always has been, and then she was gone. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the silence of the meadow wrapping around me like a gentle embrace. The weight of her absence was heavy, but so was the hope she'd left behind. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel stuck. I didn't feel trapped. I felt like I could breathe again. The meadow began to dissolve, and I closed my eyes, bracing for whatever came next. When I opened them, I was back on the city street, the cold night air brushing against my skin. The streetlights flickered overhead, and the distant hum of traffic reminded me that the world hadn't changed. But I had. When I opened my eyes again and found myself back on the city street, it felt like the world should have been different. After everything I had seen, everything I had faced, the thought of returning to the ordinary felt almost wrong. But the world doesn't pause for moments like this. It moves on, unaware of the transformations happening quietly within us. The street looked the same as when I had left it, dimly lit by the flickering glow of street lamps, wet from the earlier rain. The air was cold, biting against my skin. I looked around, half expecting her to be there, glowing faintly in the distance. But there was nothing, just me. For a moment, I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. My mind was a storm of questions. Had it all been real? Had I really been to that other place, faced those shadows, and come back lighter? Or was it some vivid dream conjured by a tired, overwhelmed brain? I reached up, almost instinctively, and touched my forehead where she'd first pressed her finger. I didn't feel anything different, but the memory of her touch lingered, warm and steady. The sound of a car passing in the distance startled me out of my thoughts. I turned, my feet moving almost on their own, and started walking. The rhythm of my footsteps on the wet pavement was soothing, grounding me in the present moment. Each step felt heavier, more deliberate, like I was anchoring myself back in reality. But reality felt different now. The memories she had shown me, those fractured, painful pieces of my life, were still fresh in my mind. I couldn't shake the image of myself sitting alone in that hallway, clutching my books while the laughter of my classmates echoed around me, or the version of me that lashed out in anger, desperate to protect itself from more pain. They weren't just memories anymore. They were pieces of me I could finally recognize, pieces I could no longer ignore. And then there were the possibilities, the visions of what my life could be if I let myself move forward, if I dared to hope again. They felt fragile, like whispers carried on the wind, but they were there, waiting for me. As I walked, I found myself replaying her words in my mind. The light is within you. It always has been. At the time, they had felt comforting, almost poetic. But now, in the cold reality of the city, they felt weighty, like a challenge. If the light had always been within me, why had it taken her to make me see it? Why hadn't I been able to find it on my own? The truth was I didn't know where to start. I rounded a corner and found myself staring at the entrance to my apartment building. The familiar sight of the cracked steps and the peeling paint on the door should have been comforting, but instead, it felt like a wall. A reminder of everything I had been trying to escape when I first went walking that night. The thought of going back inside, of facing the same cluttered space and the same gnawing silence, made my chest tighten. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the door, my feet rooted to the ground. I could feel the weight of old habits pulling at me, whispering that it was easier to go back to the way things were, to slip back into the routines that numbed the pain but never truly healed it. But I couldn't. Not now. With a deep breath, I turned away from the door and kept walking. I didn't know where I was going. There wasn't a plan or a destination in mind. I just knew I needed to move, to prove to myself that I could. The city felt different now, quieter somehow. Or maybe I was just more aware of the quiet. The distant hum of traffic, the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze, the occasional drip of water from an overflowing gutter. It all seemed more vivid, more alive. For so long, I had been drowning in the noise of my own mind, unable to hear anything else. Now, for the first time, I felt like I could breathe. I walked until my legs ached, until the chill in the air seeped into my bones. The streets blurred together, one dimly lit block blending into the next. But I didn't stop. There was something about the motion, the act of moving forward, that felt necessary. Like it was the first step in proving to myself that I could do this. Eventually, I found myself standing at the edge of a small park. It wasn't much, Just a patch of grass with a few benches and a couple of trees. But it was enough. I sat down on one of the benches, the cold metal pressing through my coat, and stared out at the empty playground in the distance. For the first time that night, I allowed myself to sit still. The thoughts I had been holding at bay came rushing in all at once. What was I supposed to do now? I had faced my shadows, forgiven myself for the things I'd been carrying, but the idea of actually changing my life still felt overwhelming. The visions she had shown me were beautiful, inspiring, but they were also terrifying. Could I really become that version of myself? The one who tried, who risked, who cared. I didn't have the answers, but as I sat there, I realized something important. I didn't need to have all the answers right now. Healing wasn't something that happened overnight. It wasn't a single moment of clarity or a sudden burst of courage. It was a process, a journey. Her words echoed in my mind again, softer this time, but no less powerful. The next step is yours to take. I looked up at the sky, the stars barely visible through the haze of city lights. I thought about her, the way she had appeared out of nowhere and changed everything. I didn't know what she was, an angel, a guide, a figment of my imagination, but it didn't matter. What mattered was what she had shown me, what she had awakened in me. For the first time in a long time, I felt a spark of hope. It was small, fragile, but it was there. And it was enough. I stood up from the bench, my legs stiff from the cold, and started walking again. This time, I wasn't wandering aimlessly. I wasn't running from anything. I was walking toward something, toward a version of myself I hadn't believed I could be, toward a life I had thought was out of reach. The city was still the same, but I wasn't. And that was enough to make everything feel different. As I made my way back toward my apartment, I felt the weight of her words settling into my chest, grounding me. The light is within you. It was there, waiting for me to nurture it, to let it grow. And for the first time in years, I believed it. The next morning, the world felt different. Not in the way that everything looked brighter or more hopeful, but in a quieter, subtler way, like the air itself had shifted. For the first time in years, I woke up without the crushing weight of dread pressing against my chest. It was strange, almost disorienting, and I lay there in bed for a long time, staring at the cracked ceiling and trying to make sense of it. Her words lingered in my mind. The light is within you. It always has been. It was a comforting thought, but also an intimidating one. If the light had always been there, why hadn't I felt it before? Why had it taken someone or something like her to make me see it? My phone buzzed on the nightstand, breaking the stillness. I reached for it, half expecting another overdue notice or a curt text from my boss. But it was just a notification, social media reminding me of its existence, pulling me toward the endless scroll of other people's lives. I ignored it, tossing the phone back onto the table. That small act felt like the first choice I'd made for myself in a long time. The apartment was quiet as I got out of bed, my feet brushing against the cold floor. The clutter was still there. The pile of unopened mail on the counter, the stack of dishes in the sink, but it didn't feel as suffocating as it usually did. For once, it didn't feel like a reflection of my failure. It just felt like stuff, things I could deal with one piece at a time. I made coffee, the bitter smell filling the small space, and sat at the table, staring at the cup like it held answers. I thought about the vision she had shown me the night before, the possibilities I hadn't dared to imagine, apologies I needed to make, risks I needed to take, lives I hadn't allowed myself to live. One memory in particular stood out, the vision of me sitting at a desk, writing. I didn't know what I was working on in the vision, but I remembered the feeling it gave me, purpose, focus, the kind of energy I hadn't felt in years. The idea of writing again felt both thrilling and terrifying. I hadn't written anything in so long. not since I'd given up on the dream of being a writer. It had seemed impossible, like chasing smoke, and I'd let it slip away without much of a fight. But now, sitting here with my coffee and the echo of her words in my mind, I felt a flicker of something, curiosity, maybe, or determination. Could I still do it? Could I even try? I pushed the thought aside for the moment, focusing instead on the present. I wasn't ready to dive into something as big as that yet. First, I needed to take smaller steps to prove to myself that I could follow through, even in the smallest ways. The pile of mail on the counter caught my eye. It wasn't much, just a few unopened envelopes, most of them bills I'd been too afraid to look at. I got up, walked over to the counter, and picked up the first envelope. It was a small thing, opening that letter, but it felt like a victory. A small act of defiance against the fear that had kept me paralyzed for so long. The next hour passed in a blur of small tasks. I opened the mail, washed the dishes, and cleared a few things off the cluttered table. Each task felt like a step forward, a quiet reminder that I was capable of moving, of doing. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep the spark alive. By the time I finished, the apartment didn't look all that different, but it felt different. I felt different, lighter somehow. As the day stretched on, I kept thinking about her, about the way she had appeared out of nowhere, like some kind of miracle, and changed everything. I still didn't know what she was or why she had chosen me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that her presence had been more than chance. It was like she had known exactly what I needed, even when I hadn't known it myself. I thought about the shadows she had made me face, the fractured parts of myself that had been hiding in the corners of my mind. They weren't gone. Those pieces of me still existed, still lingered in the background. But they didn't feel as heavy now. I didn't feel as afraid of them. They were just parts of me, parts one could choose to acknowledge without letting them control me. As the sun began to set, casting a warm orange glow through the windows, I found myself standing at the small desk in the corner of the room. It was covered in papers and random clutter, things I hadn't touched in months. I hesitated for a moment, then began clearing it off, making space. The act felt symbolic, like I was carving out a corner of my life for something new. Once the desk was clear, I sat down and stared at the blank surface in front of me. My hands hovered over the keyboard of my laptop, hesitant. The doubts crept in again, whispering that I didn't know what I was doing, that I wasn't good enough, that it didn't matter. But I didn't let them stop me this time. I took a deep breath and started typing. The words came slowly at first, halting and awkward, but I didn't care. I just let them come, one by one, until they began to take shape. It wasn't much, just a few paragraphs about nothing in particular, but it felt like a start, like a step toward the person I wanted to become. When I finally stopped, I sat back and stared at the screen, a strange mix of pride and vulnerability washing over me. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even good, but it was mine. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. The night crept in, the city outside coming alive with the sounds of cars and distant voices. I turned off the laptop and sat in the quiet, letting the stillness settle over me. For so long, I had been afraid of the quiet, of the things it forced me to confront. But now it didn't feel so daunting. It felt like space to grow, to heal, to figure out what came next. I didn't have all the answers. I didn't know what the future would hold or how many times I would stumble along the way. But I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't running anymore. And that, for now, was enough.